So we are continuing the discussions about different topics that are taught in schools with PG students from the University of York giving their input using their subject knowledge from their university studies, which of course have happened very recently. So now we have the topic of the First World War with Tom Webster and Henry Jarrett. Apologies, Henry. Thank you.
Cheers, Helen. Share the screen. Can everyone see that all right? Sorry. Fantastic.
Okay, so hello everyone. So today, Henry and I are going to talk to you about the First World War as it's taught in Key Stage 3. And we want you to think about what should we include when teaching World War One. If you go to the next slide, please, Henry. So this is a brief introduction. I'm sure most of you are aware already, but the First World War was a global conflict between the years of 1914 and 1918, between what were known as the Allies and the Central Powers. Now we've got a little box underneath with the Allies and the Central Powers. So it's Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States post 1917, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And really what we want you to get from this is that there is a focus on those countries and those powers, and it's gone away from a world war perspective, and that's what we want to talk about, how it was a world war. There were many different countries, many different peoples that were instrumental in the war, and we want to broaden that horizon, get away from that Anglo-centric kind of European perspective. And underneath, as you can see, the war was fought in many locations across the world, and some historians suggest that over 70 million died in the conflict.
Yeah, so in order to kind of get an understanding of the topic and how it's taught in schools, me and Tom looked at how it's taught in our placement schools currently, and our experiences in education ourselves, whilst looking at other schools' curriculums as well. And the same sort of themes kept coming up, as mentioned in one of the previous presentations. Particularly in my school, there's a huge focus on trench warfare. So how the war was fought between two trenches in northern France and sort of Belgium. There's a particular focus on trench life as well. So what was soldiers' experiences, British soldiers' experiences of the First World War, living in that trench, so looking up things like mortality rates, where they're getting fed, sort of daily life. And then we found that a large percentage as well used the Battle of the Somme as a case study in looking at the British Army's leadership, looking at the failings and the lessons that were learned from that. So some other reoccurring topics that we noticed coming up was the Christmas truce. My school in particular likes to teach that during the week building up to the Christmas holidays. The home front, so looking at how the country was in the time of war in relation to sort of rationing and hospitals and recruitment as well. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the World War I recruitment posters. The causes of the war, so looking more so at sort of the alliance system that was in place between the Allies and the Central Powers at the time, and how that was a major cause. Then looking at sort of the trigger cause being the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Serbia, I believe, and then sort of the development of weapons. This was the first war that used tanks, grenades, and gas as machine guns as well. And then as a result of the new sort of weapons, they were able to develop sort of medicines of cauterization and sort of looking at how to better deal with sort of casualties of war. And then we kind of sat and discussed how what are the problems that arise of this? So as Tom said previously, it creates a very Anglo-centric and narrow view of what is called the World War. It constricts students' sort of perception of it to being just a war fought in northern France and Belgium between Great Britain and Germany, with no sort of nod to the fact that the French were there as well. We thought that the focus on sort of developing weapons could be in some ways problematic. We thought it could potentially be quite a sensitive subject for students, perhaps if their parents are serving or if they've got a former military within their family. And leading on from the sort of trench warfare, it suggests that that was the only way the war was fought, when in reality, the war was fought in a number of different ways across the globe, as we'll come to discuss later. And again, yeah, students only kind of get the perception that white British soldiers fought under the British Army, which is something that we'd quite like to debunk, and we'll discuss it again later in the presentation.
Okay, so a question: how could this be changed? And it might be important while we're going through this to reflect on your own teaching experience and your school experience. Have things changed, and if so, how much, by what degree? Henry and I believe that, as I'm sure you all do, we have a responsibility to teach how the British were involved with the First World War, as it played a large role, and largely it's important to the national identity of Britain. However, it's also to remember, it's good to remember that some students might not identify with British identity. You might have a class that they don't feel that connection. So there needs to be a broad acknowledgement that it was a world war, rather than a war that took place between Great Britain and Germany in northern France and Belgium. As I previously said, there were many different countries and races that we are going to talk about in the next slides. So this is an image, and it's an image of the Chinese Labour Corps, and I'm just going to give you a bit of information. If you go to the next slide, please, Henry. So this is a brief context. So in 1912, the newly formed Chinese government, the Republic of China, wanted to modernize. In 1914, it was only 2 years old. America and Europe were forcing China into unfair trade deals. China wanted the European countries to see it as a major power and a strong nation. China offered the British and French their troops, their soldiers. However, this was rejected as they preferred the more modernized Japan. Now, the turning point here was the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The huge scale of losses at the Somme shook British confidence. So in 1916, the British finally accepted China's offer. Although they did not accept the offer of troops, they accepted the offer of Chinese laborers. So the British recruited men and the French from the north of China. And I've just got some bullet points here. And I think it's important, that heading, the forgotten soldiers, because we believe that they are very much the forgotten soldiers. They were instrumental in, David Olusoga says, in the machine of war. Around 140,000 Chinese laborers worked behind the lines in northern France between 1916 and 1920. The CLC, or the Chinese Labour Corps, worked in various roles: building and maintaining trenches, tank maintenance, which is incredibly significant because, as Henry mentioned, the tanks were a hugely significant weapon used in World War I. And they also built roads, loaded ammunition and goods. And it's really important to notice that the CLC, their contracts remained active until 1920, so post the end of the war, remaining in northern France to fill in trenches, dismantle railway lines, and dig up and remove bodies. I personally did not know this, and this is actually a topic that my mentor at my mentor school, my placement, they taught to actually a year 10 class, and it was tremendously good. Like it was very good. The student engagement, you could see it was that light bulb moment that we all covet as teachers, that they hadn't really considered it. And I'll have to admit, I had no idea that the Chinese laborers had such a crucial role. And the next slide, please. So this is a picture of a worker in Hubei province, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, putting the final touches to the Chinese Labour Corps memorial. Now, the memorial was dedicated to the tens of thousands of Chinese who served on the Western Front during the First World War. So it's a 9.6 metre high marble habayo, I think I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sorry if I'm not. It's a traditional ceremonial column, and unfortunately, I might be wrong on this, but I have researched it quite extensively, and it hasn't actually made it to London yet. So it's supposed to be erected in London, but if you notice, it's the Hubei province, which is where COVID reared its ugly head from. So it hasn't managed to make it yet. But what does this tell us? What does this show us? I think it shows us that there is a shift in the narrative, starting to view the wider picture, not just from the Anglo-centric perspective. So next slide, please. Now, this picture here, just from looking at it, you might just think this is, because these graves, these white gravestones, are normally associated with the Allied forces casualties and deaths. However, this is actually a picture of Chinese graves in the Noyelles-sur-Mer Chinese cemetery in the Somme region. And there's an inscription in the graveyard, and it says, "This site commemorates the sacrifice paid by 1,900 Chinese workers who lost their lives during the 1914 to 1918 war. These are my friends and colleagues whose merits are incomparable." But I didn't know about this, and when I was going through school, this was something I hadn't been taught. So why has it been airbrushed out? Why don't we, I'm generalizing, but why don't we know about this? And David Olusoga, again, mentioned him quite a lot in his documentary World War. He says the Chinese laborers are probably the most forgotten of the forgotten, but they were hugely, they paid a great sacrifice and hugely instrumental in the war effort.
Yeah, so following up from what Tom said in regards to foreign soldiers contributing to the British war effort, I paid particular attention to looking at imperial soldiers that from the British Empire that contributed heavily to the war effort, but don't really get sort of a look in Key Stage 3 curriculums to a extent great enough in comparison to their contribution. So on the screen right now, you should be able to see a picture of some Indian soldiers. Now, the British Raj, which is modern day India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, contributed over 1.3 million soldiers, with more coming from Ceylon, which is modern day Sri Lanka. These played a massive role in both on the Western Front and in the Middle East Front, and they contributed a huge amount to the war effort, both in terms of soldiers and sort of food and stuff like and all of that stuff. Anzac is a phrase that's used quite often, but no one seems to really know what it means. It stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. Around 416,000 from Australia, New Zealand fought in the conflict under the command of the British Empire. Now, this is not something as well that's been particularly looked at within Key Stage 3 curriculums, but when you consider the role that they played you feel like that they should get a fair amount of sort of representation and being memorised in history. On the screen on the left-hand side, this is a photo of British and Anzac forces in Egypt, which at the time was a British colony. There was a lot of conflicts there going on between British imperial forces and German imperial forces, as well as Ottoman imperial forces. And if you look at that photo and compare it in your head to, well, if you look at both of these photos and you compare it in your head to standard photos of World War I, where you might see trenches, bombs, gas attacks, it's quite a strong juxtaposition to what we would normally expect to see when we think of the First World War. On the right-hand side is an artistic impression of the Anzac forces landing at a beach during the Gallipoli campaign. Now, the Gallipoli was a campaign in what's modern day Turkey against the Ottoman Empire, and was actually one of the biggest conflicts and military operations of the war, but it never seems to be looked at in Key Stage 3. Most of these soldiers were Anzac forces, and a lot of Anzac forces passed away during this conflict. And it kind of makes you beg to think of why, when they were kind of fighting on behalf of the British, does this huge conflict and not get this huge operation not get looked at with any particular time. South African soldiers, again, the British colony of South Africa contributed over 230,000 soldiers to the British imperial war effort. But what's really interesting to consider about this was, at the time, the South African forces were still being segregated into whites and blacks. If you were a white soldier who enlisted, you were automatically a higher rank than a black soldier, and black soldiers were often given worse food, living quarters, worse training, and were often given the more dangerous missions, which is really interesting, because when looking at the First World War and how it's taught in Key Stage 3, the themes of sort of racism and segregation don't seem to come up a lot. But considering this was happening in a branch of the British Empire, and there are some cases of racism by British officers that went down to support them, you'd think it would be sort of brought to the forecourt more so.
Right, so remembrance. Now, remembrance plays a huge role in British schools, both in and out of the history classroom, to the point where it's become part of British national identity. Now, I just want you to think about, if you have ever engaged with remembrance, 2 minute silence, what do you remember? What do you think about? I'm not going to ask for you to answer that. I just want you to think about that. Obviously, we know that the poppy are heavily associated with the First World War, and again, we're going back to this. Henry and I are going back to this, that we feel like we have a responsibility as history teachers to ensure that remembrance is taught with the right level of sensitivity and respect, and there needs to be an appreciation that we are not appreciation. It needs to happen that we're not just remembering, British soldiers or European soldiers. We are remembering all those countries and all those people that that fell in the war. Next slide, please, Henry.
Can you not see it? Sorry.
Sorry. I think my internet connection's a bit unstable. Sorry if I'm going a bit like R2-D2. So the conclusion. So we hope that we've been able to give you our perspective on how we feel there should be a broader approach in teaching the First World War to Key Stage 3. And there is so much important content. Obviously, we're not discrediting that, but we think we need to expand the horizons for students to allow them to acknowledge that this was a world war, not just a European war, a world war, that the whole world and people from all over the world became involved.
Yeah, and just following up from what Tommy said in the previous slide, remembrance is such an integral part of sort of British identity now that it needs to be it will still be respected and it still will take place every year. But what we need to do is our responsibility as history teachers is to acknowledge as well that it has in some ways become politicized, often with some right-wing groups, and we need to ensure that that's not the case and that we acknowledge what the poppy stands for. It stands for the British Legion and the charity work that they do, as well as remembering fallen soldiers. At the same time, we also need to sort of accept and move on with the fact that remembrance has changed a lot, and we feel like that's to do with the fact that as younger generations are not going to be able to identify or connect with it, so that it, obviously recently we've started seeing sort of LGBTQ poppies and white poppies as a way of remembrance, but we need to be careful that obviously that doesn't kind of create a divide with what remembrance is actually for and what the poppy stands for. And yeah, as Tommy said previously, we need to kind of acknowledge that British soldiers weren't just white men that fought in Belgium and France. We need to remember that many British colonies did contribute a lot of lives to the war effort. So yeah, just another comment from me. World War I is a very large subject when you look at it. There was a lot of things that we could have included, such as the German perspective or the Russian perspective, or even looking at the Armenian genocide, which is one thing that I looked at university, and the significance of that in the First World War. But we do have to be, obviously there's so much history in this war that we wouldn't probably never be able to fit it all into a scheme of work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. That is fantastically important topic because we keep getting this one wrong, and this is one where there's so much support out there for us now, particularly as a result of the centenary efforts. Just a few observations, because I've worked on this quite a bit, as to why it may go astray. I think the phrase World War, which is of its time, or the Great War as it was called at the time, can cause problems that didn't happen in the past. So Great War, I had to untangle that with some European colleagues because they were thinking of it as great as in the American definition of great as wonderful, and I had to explain that no, great can mean great and terrible, great and huge, great, and the word great is very nuanced and complex, or at least it used to be. And likewise, isn't it interesting that with a top-down approach, World War, you people in 1920, if you said world and you said Britain, would have connected to world more than we do now, because Britain is no longer a world power in the same way. So one can see the roots of some of these problems as well as some of the more recent forgettings, and we have to work around them. I think the other thing that is often quite problematic is the concept of things like home front and who gets remembered and who gets involved. And so who was military, who counted as military? And it's quite interesting that even right back in the early 1920s, when the Women's Memorial for the British Empire was put together, there was quite a deliberate debate and discussion about that memorial was not just going to be about women in uniform. It was going to be a wider definition of contribution to war. But when does the actual engagement with war begin and end is fascinating, because of course it's under so much change in that period as well, and depends where you are in the world. I think there's been a lot of successful work gone on, and I would suggest to you that developing your really interesting ideas on China and the Chinese labourers, to actually focus on one particular life or one particular group as part of a lesson is very useful. And in that you can include, for example, in the same cemetery, you could find a Chinese grave and you could find the grave of a British person probably of the middling or middle upper classes. And you could immediately look at what was known about that person. So they have the same grave that looks very similar in the same cemetery, in the same, wet part of Belgium. And yet even unpicking what is known, and the answer will be, lots is possible to be known now, lots is left, lots of fragments of the person's past are left to us, of the upper middle class British person, and it's probably very hard to find out much about the background and provenance of the Chinese person's life, and that itself needs flagging up, that those gaps, those distortions which happen because of what's valued to be preserved in terms of the memories of a person's life. So I think you can probably do some quite interesting things with sources and evidence in relation to that. And just to also flag up yes, please do, Henry. Sorry.
This obviously wasn't part of it, but looking at German memorials as well is quite an interesting task for Key Stage 3, by because I've been to Belgium myself and seen that there's a stark contrast between the British and the German grave sites and memorials, and a lot of people think that's to do with the fact that that Germany got less land to build their memorials and dig their graves, which in some ways is true, but at the same time there's a different in culture in the way that they remember, so that it's a lot more somber, whereas in Britain it's a lot more it's more glorifies it. If I could put a picture in now, I'd show you, but it's something quite interesting to look at if anyone's interested.
I think that's a really perceptive point, Henry. We were once in Langemark German Cemetery with a German student, and she said she was brilliant. She was very she was confident and assertive enough to say, "Can I just stop and say that for me this feels much more normal, because if I'm at home I go for a walk in the woods, because for Germany our forests are really important." And she said to us, "Think about all those Grimm's fairy tales you have as children where everything happens in the forest. We have a lot of forest, we love our forest." So these memorial cemeteries that are designed as English gardens are very English, and that's lovely, but for me, coming from a German culture, this feels more well, just more culturally familiar. And that was like, everybody went, "Oh wow, that's really interesting." Yeah, it's fascinating. Depending where you go in the world as well, of course, the conflict stops, as they so accurately said, stops being global 14 to 18, but there are still a lot of regional conflicts that tie into this. For example, if you're down in northern Greece, the conflict goes on well beyond 1918. So once that world war shrinks back to regional conflict, having started as regional conflict, then then you get some really different narratives coming out as well. It is indeed a vast topic. Does anybody else want to add anything on the recording moment? And I can't see you, so please shout up if you do.
I did have a question. Imogen and I have taught World War I in our schools, and we've come up against the same kind of problem of there being a lack of representation of empire. And we've tried to rectify that. But one problem seems to be that it's just such a vast topic. And actually, I was only given like one and a half at most lessons to deal with this. And I didn't get to talk about the troops from Australia and New Zealand, for example, or the troops from South Africa. So my question was if there was a way to, you'd thought of a way to teach all this kind of concisely, but not missing anything out, if there was a specific approach that you would suggest, or if you would suggest maybe leaving out some parts of the First World War, or not spending so much time on, say, trench warfare, for example, which we seem to spend like weeks and weeks on, in favour of giving more time to this.
I would say...
Sorry, go on, Tommy.
Oh, well, I say it's like the hot air balloon theory. Not theory, but, you know, what do we leave out? What do we put in? And that is a lot of power as a teacher. And I don't think, honestly, I personally don't think that there is a way. I think you just have to hope that you're have a clear teaching goal in mind, and hope that you can achieve, you know, what the knowledge and the concepts that you want your students to get, and try and keep it as broad as possible. But like you said, there is so much information and so many different experiences that how do you, with time constraints of school, how do you keep it all in? So I don't know if you've got an answer for that, Henry, because that just sounded very wishy-washy. I'm sorry, but you know, it's very difficult. I don't know if you've got a...
Just to add on to that, I completely kind of understand also the problems that you're having at your placement, because at my school there's absolutely, it is fully trench based and fully home front based. There is no sort of mention of imperial contributions, which for me, is being my specialism, that's pretty tough not to incorporate. So I think that as we're still moving into this post-colonial era, we will start to see more of it happen. I think it's been brought to the conversation. I don't know if you've seen the film 1917, but there was a Sikh soldier in one of the scenes, and some people kind of brought that up to kind of bring up that conversation of the imperial contributions to the First World War, whereas a lot of people criticised it for being a sign of tokenism. So I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of teaching this subject, but it is hard because it is, obviously we need to teach it from a British perspective as part, so that students can identify with it. So that's why we did focus more so on British imperial soldiers rather than sort of looking at maybe France or Russia. Sorry, I know that probably wasn't the best answer to that question, but I think it's something that we are still kind of figuring out.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, Millie, I'm very aware of time as well.
Okay,
so I might
no worries.
rounding this one up and then do it if we, okay, because we've sort of gone on to half an hour, but I just want to round up Elsa's thing there as well. I think the three of you are doing exactly the first thing that's necessary there, one which is actually questioning the disposition to sort of keep challenging and struggling and wrestling and thinking about how we build that coherence. So how much do we step back into our topic of empire to set it up? And just a couple of things that I would add in. One is knowing your own pupils as ever, because then thinking about what would be that interrupting moment. So if you think you've got students who are very much locked into a poppy at a local war memorial in a local village, then actually doing something that interrupts the thinking, looking for those interrupting moments. And the third would be the idea of the meals where this might lend itself to a homework partway through the sequence, where in fact the meanwhile elsewheres all go off and research a particular different angle of the empire, and then you allow 5-10 minutes at the beginning of a lesson for them to swap and tell each other what they've learned, and that would draw out this massive diversity. Not as a full solution, but just possibly an idea.